Welcome to Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War, a new series from the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare at Marine Corps University. Each episode will feature a snapshot of daily events from the war, with a deeper look at one important development our audience should know about, all from the insights of Team Krulak Distinguished Fellow and Russia subject matter expert Dr. Yuval Weber. All right, I'm here. This is Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare. And we're here with Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russian subject matter expert at the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, to give us a top-line overview of some of the major events from the last day or two, and as well get into some of the things we're seeing from the Russian leadership. So, Dr. Weber, welcome, and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Major Brown. This will be the first, and hopefully this series will not last too long, but I thought it would be interesting, and we thought it would be interesting to maybe speak for 5-10 minutes a day about big issues and what we've seen in the news cycle. So to those who are listening or those who are watching, please do send us your questions through all the normal channels, and we'll be taking your questions. If not live, at least in a live-like setting. So what I thought I want to talk about today is something positive, or perhaps positive. And that would be the status of the current peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia to bring the war to an end. Now, obviously, when Russia came into the war itself, they had a lot of desires, a lot of demands. And particularly these were mainly aimed at NATO and the United States. And the big ones were the ones that were revealed in November of last year. This would be for NATO to remove any of its military infrastructure from all the states that joined after 1997. So this is basically NATO's eastern flank. Baltic states, Central Europe, Southeast Europe, all of those places. They wanted NATO to agree not to take in any new members. And not only did they name Ukraine directly, but this would have also covered Finland, Sweden, Switzerland and Austria, who knows, anybody. They wanted NATO to also cease all activities in all parts of the former Soviet Union. So not just the Baltic states, but also Turkey ceasing any activities in the Caucasus, things of that nature. And they wanted NATO to remove all nuclear weapons from Europe. When it came to, when you summarize it all together, what Russia wanted to do in contemporary language was for NATO to cancel itself and to just stop doing anything that it has been doing for the past 25 odd years. And from the Ukrainians, they wanted denazification. And from the Russian perspective, the Nazi word is not just referring to historical Germans of a different era, but anyone who opposed Soviet power, and therefore Russia being the successor, anyone who opposes Russia. And so the people who came into power in Ukraine after Euromaidan in 2014, because they oppose Russia, in the sense of they refuse to be an imperial subject of Russia, therefore they are Nazis. And so what Putin wanted is not to recreate the Soviet Union per se, but he wanted to recreate something of a relationship like what Russia has with Belarus, which is far more imperial in nature, which is Belarus rules itself except on the issues in which Russia has an interest. And therefore, those big decisions, foreign policy, security policy, economic policy, those get countersigned in Moscow, or the directions come from Moscow. So unlike the Soviet Union, where Moscow ruled directly and paid directly, this is a much looser relationship. And that's ultimately what Russia has wanted in Ukraine for a number of years. They also wanted demilitarization. So just for Ukraine to give up the 250,000 army that it's been developing over the past 8 years in preparation for this conflict, and for Ukraine to also adopt a strict neutrality, meaning that they can't join any bloc. And this is not just NATO, but also the European Union. And that's really one of the big fears that the Russians have had for a number of years, is that if Ukraine, an imperial subject, is able to get into Europe in the sense of becoming a happy, healthy European country, that would reflect very, very poorly on Russia. Because if the Ukrainians can do it, why couldn't the Russians? That is really like the great power paradox that Putin didn't want to be put in any longer. So we've had this conflict, and what we've seen in future episodes, we'll really get into the basics of what has happened over the past 3 weeks. But suffice it to say, the initial plan of winning in 2 days didn't work out as intended. The original plan of taking Kiev in 2 days and then collecting surrenders for the next 2 weeks has floundered. According to yesterday's Pentagon briefing, the intelligence community estimates that 7,000 Russian soldiers have died in the past 3 weeks. That's a lot of people. That's more than what the United States has lost in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 odd years. And then if we go for another 3 weeks and we get to 14,000, then we'll be approaching in, let's say, a month and a half, because already 7,000 is roughly half of what the Soviet Union lost in 10 years of its Afghanistan war. So obviously, Russia didn't get what it wanted. It's not doing well in the field, but it can still win by just leveling every Ukrainian city. So what does the peace negotiations look like? We've had really good notes from the Russian side and from the Ukrainian side, and the contours of it are pretty clear. So what the Ukrainians are looking for, let's start there. The Ukrainians obviously want a ceasefire and for the Russians to leave. That's the non-negotiable. What do the Russians want at minimum? They want Ukraine to provide protections for Russian language, media, and education, to forswear NATO membership, and to not host any permanent bases of foreign troops. Now, obviously, protections for Russian language in the education sphere, the media sphere, to make it a second official language of the country, they probably could have gotten all that for free before the war. Forswearing NATO membership, President Zelensky has already given up on that. He's made the realization and has said it in real time that NATO is not taking Ukraine in at any time soon. That was also clear beforehand because you can't have a territorial dispute and get into NATO. So that's also just acknowledging reality. And in terms of the permanent basing of foreign troops, that will lead us into, in essence, the big questions that remain unanswered. What does not permanent basing mean when one of Ukraine's other main demands is that its security is provided for by guarantees of other states? And this would be explicitly Turkey, Germany, France, the UK, and the US working with Russia to provide security guarantees to both Ukraine and Russia in order to get to whatever at least legitimate root causes may exist to have caused this particular war. So what would Russia accept if Ukraine's demands are external security guarantees? Would the Russians accept basically some sort of continual redeployment into and out of Ukraine by NATO forces? President Biden has said that at minimum, there are going to be more NATO troops around Ukraine, and there's certainly going to be more missiles. I think he has said, I should have written this note down, nuclear, but certainly non-nuclear conventional missiles will be ringing around Ukraine, pointed at Belarus, Kaliningrad, and basically all of European Russia. From the Russian side, in essence, is this sincere? Just today, President Putin had not sure how to call it, a rah-rah rally, as he said, Major Brown, earlier. But the language over the last couple of days is about, the 1930s level language. National traitors need to purify the culture. There are people inside the country who are not working for the interests of Russia. This suggests that whatever happens in Ukraine over the next couple of weeks, part of what Putin will do in order to keep power at home is rooting out every single person who's not enthusiastic about the war effort. Already several FSB, that is intelligence generals, have been arrested. Two of them being the part of the FSB section that is responsible for foreign intelligence. So all the billions of dollars that went to these two guys, Sergei Beseda is the top general and his deputy, that went to Ukraine in order to create the fifth column inside Ukraine. Apparently they didn't believe that the war was ever going to happen. So allegedly, at least what I've read, is they stole about 90% of it because they didn't believe the war was happening. And so when the war happened, lo and behold, there's no fifth column available. And the Ukrainians are fighting for their houses, their land, their families, their culture, their language. without too many of the saboteurs and wreckers, which obviously are now going to be discovered en masse on the Russian side. So those, I think, are, maybe the two big questions. Are the Russians sincere and are willing to talk about what the Ukrainians want in terms of rotating deployments? Or are they just using these negotiations as a ruse in order to reorganize, resupply, and reinforce for one last push? Other news that we've seen is that the Russians are pulling troops and material from the Eastern Military District, from peacekeeping duties in Armenia, that is Nagorno-Karabakh, from South Ossetia, and from other places. So, it's never a good sign when you're repositioning forces, because what it means is on the back end, the only thing that keeps, let's say, Japan from taking the Kuril Islands or Georgia from trying to retake South Ossetia is reputational deterrence. So no good options are available here for anyone, except insofar as both sides are sincere in their desire for peace. And I think maybe that's a good place to end it for the day, unless you had some other questions.
I do, but you
Yeah, yeah.
actually, I wrote down, are they sincere is one of my questions, and you answered that. Probably the $1 million question right there. Maybe just real quick, if you could share your thoughts on, um, what if, so right now, I don't know if we characterize this as a stalemate or just very, very, very slow, grinding, horribly bloody progress by the Russians, but there have not been any sort of major changes in position of late, at least. But what if the facts on the ground change? Say there's more Russian attrition to no gains, like including some of those units you mentioned, or as there have been at least reports in recent days of limited Ukrainian counterattacks. But what if they can continue counterattacking and potentially push back on some of those gains that Russia has gotten? What does that do to future negotiations?
Well, any two sides are always negotiating while they're fighting, and the fighting shapes what are the negotiating demands at the table. And to the extent that I think one of the real big developments is obviously, as you said, the Russian advances along multiple axes have more or less stalled. They've taken a lot, they've destroyed a lot, but they're not getting any closer to encircling Kiev, like in particular, and taking the capital. What the Ukrainians have been able to do, even with like the limited counterattacks that you mentioned, is they have one clear advantage over the Russians, which is they have the U.S. Congress. U.S. Congress just approved a $13.6 billion aid package, which is split roughly half between DoD, so defense items, and the rest for humanitarian assistance to Ukrainians, both inside Ukraine as well as the refugee humanitarian situation outside Ukraine and the rest of Europe. At that point, what we're talking about, if President Biden, and so by the way, the request from President Biden started at $6 billion. Within 4 days, that more than doubled. So that goes to show you there is a bottomless barrel when it comes to support for Ukraine in this moment. We will even leave like the sanctions and all that to the side here. But what President Biden announced the other day is that there's going to be an immediate $800 million shipment of military materials. There's also going to be $186 million in humanitarian aid. What the Ukrainians are able to say to the Russians is, we have, roughly speaking, $1 billion worth of stuff coming every single week for the next 3 months. What do you look like in 3 months? That's shaping the bargaining as it is. Because once loitering munitions enters the chat, and once seems to be an infinite supply of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, manpads, javelins, NLAWs, things of that nature, enters the chat. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is in Slovakia, and the Slovak said, we will give our S-300s to the Ukrainians if basically we get it backfilled on the spot. So Patriot missiles have entered the chat. Now, at this point, there's never going to be a better opportunity for literally every country in Eastern Central Europe that has Soviet era equipment to basically upgrade at, I can only imagine it might be the most generous financing terms available in the history of defense transfers. So all that stuff is going, and even like the Dutch, like somehow have this stuff, they're giving it up. Clearly, it's all going to Ukraine for the purpose of continuing to test the skies above, and really to demonstrate to the Russians that the Russians are going to continue to bomb like cities. They're going to flatten civilian infrastructure at the expense of making sure that the sanctions regime on Russia gets deeper and deeper and continues to develop the first little cracks of the rift that we've seen between them and the Chinese. President Biden and Xi Jinping spoke over the video link today, and the Chinese side, their readout says, obviously the United States and NATO need to pay attention to the security concerns of Russia and Ukraine, sovereignty, both sides, starting to love each other once more. But also on their social media, both abroad and at home, they covered the Russians having shot up a bread line in Chernihiv. And 10 people shot by snipers in a bread line. One of those people was an American citizen, a guy who lived long, his name was Jimmy Hill, a guy who lived a long time in Czech Republic and in Ukraine, 67 years old, was still in Ukraine because his partner has multiple sclerosis and can't travel. But for her having MS, he would be gone. So he was basically in a breadline to get food for her, the other patients, and the hospital workers where she was being treated for, a chronic terminal disease. That's covered by the Chinese press, both in their English language, externally facing media, as well as in their Mandarin language domestic media. So the Chinese are recognizing they have a series of issues that are in front of them. One, if Russia collapses, then the pivot to Asia will happen in fast forward, because once Europe remilitarizes, Russia is weaker, poorer, more isolated, and is not playing a substantive role in international affairs. If Europe is able to engage in more burden sharing within NATO, and NATO doesn't cancel itself, that will permit more redeployment of the US forces, US attention, US equipment to Asia Pacific. So obviously that's bad for China. We also know that as long as Russia doesn't totally collapse, but they go down slowly, the Chinese will basically make inroads in the agriculture, energy, mineral sectors that previously the Russians had kept them at arm's length. But also, the Chinese have to be mindful of international public opinion. If the Russians are really in a bad spot with the rest of humanity, how much public support can they provide without starting to own the war themselves? And so that's why Xi is trying to find a way out that preserves his ability to control Russia into the future, but without owning Russia's war. And that basically means who knows what we can say about it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to stop, Dr. Weber, since that's one of these many sort of historical paradigm shifts we're seeing, one of many, and like we were saying before, like I've been saying, I just don't know a whole lot over the last few weeks of how so many of these things are going to play out. But yeah, well, no, I think that's definitely going to cover us for this first one. So appreciate your time, and we look forward to continuing these on a regular basis. As you said, hopefully not for long, but certainly as it's ongoing, it's definitely always valuable to get your insights on this and be able to provide us some first-person insights in a way that is incredibly valuable for our audience. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you. We can say the only prediction that we can make, or I can make, is we're going to look at 2022 as the end of post-Soviet Russia, in the same way that we look at 1991 as the end of the Soviet Union, 1989 the end of the Cold War, as changing eras of international relations.